Hi, I'm Mr. Walberg, and I'm glad you're here. This unit is called Empire Building, and usually we often talk about it as like economic empires, but sometimes it's actual empires. Turn with us now to those thrilling days of yesteryear, when out of the past come the thundering hoofbeats of Walberg's APUSH. History class rides again! We have two objectives today. By the end of this class, you should be able to examine the role of late 19th century immigration on American identity, and you should be able to summarize the events by which the United States acquired Alaska and Hawaii. Let's begin in Roman numeral number 11. Around 3.5 million immigrants, mostly from Southern and Eastern Europe, arrived in the United States in the 1890s. They were mostly viewed as different races, even though that today we wouldn't distinguish and think they're all just white. They were seen as different races at the time, all of which were inferior to native-born Americans. Between 1870 and 1920, around 20 million Europeans arrived in the United States. Some were fleeing religious persecution, like the Russian Jewish pogroms. Europe had also experienced years of population growth, resulting in a lack of farmland and jobs, and the instability of the politics of the time, with political reform movements and revolts influenced young people seeking independent lives. Various suggestions were made by nativists, people that emphasized, America for Americans. Various suggestions were made by nativists to eliminate immigrants' ability to vote. Nearly every state settled on a secret ballot. Secret ballot today, which we think of as like a hallmark of just good democracy, that your vote is your business, was actually seen as preventing voters from receiving help. That if they, didn't read the language on the ballot or something, I'm sorry, I can't help you. It's a secret ballot. It was a way of like isolating people who weren't integrated all that well and making them feel like they couldn't participate. Stringent residency and literacy voting requirements became more common. The most famous port of entry was Ellis Island. It was the chief immigration station into the United States in New York Harbor. There's all these like stories in the way that Americans tell themselves the legend of Ellis Island, and actually most of them aren't true. Ellis Island tried to run as efficiently as possible, and there's not much evidence they botched last names or broke up families. Actually, Ellis Island tried to run pretty professionally and largely succeeded at it. Immigrants were given physical exams by a doctor. People who were seriously ill weren't admitted, and inspectors checked documents to see if people met legal requirements. And between 1892 and 1924, around 17 million immigrants were processed at Ellis Island. Now, if we turn our eyes to the West Coast, it's a little bit of a different story in subpoint B. Around 300,000 Chinese immigrants arrived in the same era. The earliest ones attracted by the gold rush. They worked in railroads and farms and mines and domestic service and businesses. By the 1870s, entire families were immigrating to the United States, and they entered through a port of entry known as Angel Island, an immigrant processing station in San Francisco Bay. People there faced harsh interrogation and long waits for admission, an entirely different set of circumstances than what existed at Ellis Island. At first, Congress just outright prohibited Chinese women from entering the United States, and then in 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act said we'll bar Chinese immigration altogether. Chinese demands for equal rights eventually forced the United States Supreme Court to define the reach of the 14th Amendment in education and employment, and with mixed results. In 1893, the Supreme Court of the United States even went as far as authorizing the federal government to expel Chinese aliens without due process of law. Exclusion profoundly shaped the experience of Chinese Americans, carrying the stigma that they were incapable of assimilation. Roman numeral number 12. Something that often surprises Americans in a modern day is that the United States was not a major powerhouse in the 1880s. We were actually kind of a second-rate backwater country by the end of the 19th century. We could rival Canada and harass Mexico, and neither one of those are like world prizes. But the United States just wasn't at all close to hanging with the big dogs of Europe. And around after 1870, European powers, along with Japan, scrambled to dominate Africa and Asia and the Middle East, and justifying their just naked imperialism as civilizing the non-European world. As early as 1885, a Congregationalist minister named Josiah Strong urged Protestants to proselytize overseas. He predicted that the American Anglo-Saxon race, which isn't really a thing, but the Anglo-Saxon race would spread itself all over the earth. Such arguments were grounded in American exceptionalism, the idea that the United States had a unique destiny to go father democracy and civilization. Imperialists took this up, basing their argument on the precedent of denying citizenship to American Indians and Asian immigrants, as well as the right to vote to Southern Americans, and also used popular racial theories to justify rule over foreign people of color. Their motivations, there's a couple that are worth noting here. They confronting high unemployment and mass protest. A lot of policymakers feel that American workers would embrace socialism or communism, and the alternative, they believed, was that overseas markets could create jobs and opportunity and prosperity even back here at home. Saying that like this was a way you stave off political instability by making your own economy better by exploiting foreign economies. Territorial expansion had also been part of American life since, well before independence. The 1823 Monroe Doctrine further cemented it. Subpoint B. Secretary of State William Seward bought Seward's icebox in 1867, so back in period 5. In 1867, because the islands reached almost to Asia and could be valuable refueling stations, he paid Russia about $7.2 million in 1887. It was a pretty good deal at 2 cents an acre, but it was also called Seward's Folly, thinking the United States just spent a lot of money on a lot of snow. But in the 1890s, marked a significant turning point in America's relationship with the rest of the world. Most Americans looked overseas and were interested in expanding trade, not territorial possessions. Subpoint C. But a small group of late 19th century thinkers actively promoted American expansionism. As American policymakers saw European powers busily carving up Africa and Asia among themselves and embarking on an arms race to build steel-plated battleships, the fear of ruthless competition drove the United States to also invest in the latest weapons. While reading a history book, U.S. Navy Admiral Alfred T. Mahan began to formulate a theory that when countries have strong navies, they have great influence on the world. This book became very influential, and I think history books change the world. But he also wrote a book known as The Influence of Sea Power Upon History in 1890. It was also a history book, but a military theory, and it became one of the most important texts on warfare, influencing American militarization, but also world militarization. Urging the United States to build up the Navy, they built 9 steel-hulled cruisers, the new modern battleships like the Maine and the Oregon. It transformed the United States into the world's 3rd largest naval power. Subpoint D. Since the 1790s, so really in the earliest days of our country, since the 1790s, Hawaii had been an important shipping station on the way to China and India. Then in the 1820s, American missionaries were starting schools and churches there on the islands. Though the islands were their own kingdom, it was the Kingdom of Hawaii. By the mid-1880s, American-owned sugar plantations actually accounted for about 75% of the island's wealth. So it was an independent country, but the land was owned by Americans, like a person that has a house in Mexico or something like that, right? But this was 75% of the wealth of the Kingdom of Hawaii was tied up in American sugar plantations. By the turn of the centuries, immigrants actually outnumbered native Hawaiians 3-1. An 1876 treaty between the United States and the island's monarch gave the Hawaiian sugar a tariff-free access to the American market, saying like, hey, this is being grown on American farms. Even if it's overseas, they're American-owned farms. It should count as, imports without a tariff duty onto it. And it spiked production on the islands by 900%, which had a nice climate for sugar production. In return, it gave the U.S. control over Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor was the best port in the kingdom, and the U.S. set up a naval base there that became an important refueling station for American ships. Subpoint E. In 1887, the King Kalakaua, I think is how you say that, King Kalakaua, his interior minister, was an American lawyer, and he drafted a new constitution in the model of the United Kingdom's constitutional monarchy and urged Kalakaua to sign it, stripping him of most of his authority and giving that power to the legislature. It limited voting rights to major landowners and denied voting rights to Hawaiians of Japanese or Chinese descent. Basically, 3,000 residents and an armed militia demand that Kalakaua sign this new constitution or be deposed. When forced with that idea, he agreed to their terms, and it became known as the Bayonet Constitution, like it was forced at the point of bayonet. Subpoint F. Then the McKinley Tariff of 1890 reinstated the tariff on sugar. When we reinstated the tariff on sugar, suddenly that 900% increase in production and export, which was a good deal for the Hawaiian economy, basically came to a crashing halt. And it made American sugar cheaper than Hawaiian sugar. And it sent a shock through the Hawaiian economy. Facing new competition, American sugar planters in Hawaii called for the United States just to annex the kingdom. What if we just took it over and so they wouldn't have to pay the duty? Kalakaua died in 1891, and his sister, Queen Liliuokalani, I think is how you say that name, Queen Liliuokalani, when she took power, she brought a Hawaii for Hawaiians attitude. And she planned on re-amending the Constitution for broader voting rights. But before she could do so, U.S. businessmen organized a revolution. And with the help of the United States Marine Corps, they overthrew Queen Liliuokalani and set up a government headed by Sanford B. Dole. Though President Grover Cleveland ordered that Queen Liliuokalani be restored to the throne, he was unable to force Dole's cooperation. Cleveland, basically with his hands tied, acknowledged the new government, but pledged he wouldn't consider annexation unless the majority of Hawaiians supported it. Basically saying like, okay, fine, you're a new country, but you're not American, and we're not going to take you over unless the Hawaiians vote for it and want it. Anyway, Grover Cleveland was not president forever, and the next president, William McKinley, whom we met in our last class, favored annexation. Congress proclaimed basically proclaimed Hawaii to be a U.S. territory in 1898, even though Hawaiians never had a chance to vote on the issue. This question of empire and how the United States is going to expand into new territories, whether it's being purchased like we did in Alaska or by stealing a country like we did in Hawaii, or we're going to fight others for it, is a fascinating story, and I can't wait to tell you more about it. Make sure you like and subscribe. God bless you.